Before I formally introduce Rupert Duchesne and Stephen Lewis today, I would like to take this moment to thank Marvin Yontef and Stikeman Elliott for sponsoring today's event. Thank you, Marvin. I would also like to welcome 6 tables of students to today's lunch. They are from Branksome Hall, sponsored by Borden Ladner Gervais; Nelson A. Boylan Collegiate Institute, sponsored by Julie De Lorenzo and Diamante Development Corp; Archbishop Romero Catholic Secondary School, sponsored by Inco Limited; Leaside High School, sponsored by Navigator Limited; Kipling Collegiate Institute, sponsored by St. Joseph Communications; and Toronto Catholic District School Board Student Leaders, sponsored by RBC Financial Group. Students, would you please stand so we can recognize you? And now, before I thank all of today's student table sponsors, I just want to ask if our table of student leaders from the Toronto Catholic District School Board would stand up again. Ladies and gentlemen, this group of young people has been so inspired by the example of Stephen Lewis and others working in Africa that they're all booked to go there this summer as volunteers, and they're working hard to raise $5,000 each to make this happen. Students, could you please stand? Oh, there they are. We wish them well in their fundraising efforts, and if any of you in the audience who might want to find out how you could help them with their fundraising efforts, please see Lynn Chu at our registration desk on the way out. Thank you, students, and thank you to all of today's student sponsors for your ongoing support. And now I'd like to introduce today's special guests. It is fitting that in the season of giving, we should turn our attention to the topic of giving. And with us today, we have 2 speakers who have recently joined together to become trailblazers in the field of philanthropy. I'm of course talking about the partnership which brought together Aeroplan, the Stephen Lewis Foundation, and 6 other leading not-for-profits, including Canadian Executive Service Organization and Médecins Sans Frontières. This collaboration, known as the Beyond Miles program, has got to be one of the most creative partnerships in the philanthropic field. A partnership which enables Aeroplan members to donate millions of reward miles that might otherwise lapse to cover the travel costs associated with programs ranging from preserving the world's wild spaces to, in the case of the Stephen Lewis Foundation, getting childcare programs for AIDS orphans in Zambia and Tanzania. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about Beyond Miles, but before we do, I want to share a bit of background on our 2 speakers. British-born Rupert Duchesne began his flirtation with the aviation world as a cadet with the Royal Air Force. He earned a BSc in pharmacology at the University of Leeds and followed it up with an MBA from the University of Manchester. Rupert joined Air Canada in 1996 after serving as Vice President, Mercer Management Consulting, and head of Mercer's worldwide aviation practice, first in London, England, and subsequently in Toronto. In August 2000, he was appointed president of the newly created Aeroplan division and asked to chart growth in the mainstream loyalty marketplace and to develop Air Canada's presence in the e-retailing environment. I'm told that when Rupert was growing up, his parents insisted that he set aside money, his pocket money, for charity. Now that he's a parent himself, I'm told his 2 daughters are following his example by putting aside 1/3 of their allowance as well. Well done, Rupert. And now a bit about Stephen Lewis. At the end of this month, Mr. Lewis's 5-year term as the UN Secretary General Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS in Africa will draw to a close. But we're lucky because he'll continue his work in the fight against AIDS through the Stephen Lewis Foundation. Mr. Lewis's work around the world has inspired many people, young and old alike, and it's a pleasure to have an entire table of students with us today who are going to Africa this coming summer as volunteers, inspired by his example. Stephen Lewis was an Ontario MPP for 15 years and led the Ontario New Democratic Party for 8 of those. including as leader of the official opposition. In 1984, he became Canada's ambassador to the United Nations in New York and later served as Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, or UNICEF. On an educational note, Stephen Lewis holds 24 honorary degrees from Canadian universities and is a senior fellow of Massey College. He's also the inaugural scholar-in-residence at the Institute on Globalization and the Human Condition at McMaster University. It is almost no surprise, then, that in 2005, Stephen was named by Time magazine one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He was cited in the category that includes the Dalai Lama, Bill Gates, Nelson Mandela, and Oprah Winfrey. Ladies and gentlemen, before I turn things over to our very capable moderator, Amanda Lang, a Canadian Club director and the co-anchor of Squeeze Play on Report on Business Television, let me just say that it is a great pleasure to have both Rupert Duchesne and Stephen Lewis on our podium. Please join me in welcoming them. And now, as Stephen, Rupert, and Amanda get ready on our mini stage, I'd like to ask you to turn your attention to the big screen videos at the front of the room. We have 2 short videos to show you. First, let's look at a brief overview of the Beyond Miles program. Our next clip provides a snapshot of how Beyond Miles donations paid off for the Stephen Lewis Foundation this summer when 100 grandmothers and project leaders from 11 sub-Saharan African countries were flown to Toronto to meet with 200 Canadian grandmothers. This event, the Grandmothers Gathering, received press coverage around the world, and we're pleased to be able to show you a rough clip from an upcoming film on the Grandmothers Gathering being produced by the Foundation. Can you roll the clip, please?
We got a taste of African activism in Canada recently when the Foundation hosted a groundbreaking Grandmothers Gathering. To shine a light on the heroism of African grandmothers and to encourage a new movement of Canadian grandmothers supporting them, we brought some 300 grannies together to spend a life-changing weekend. They sang and cried, told each other their stories, and shared strategies for support and social change.
Most affected groups are orphans.
We are going to march to show the world what the African and Canadian grandmothers will do to change the face of AIDS.
As we took to the streets in a spirited march, it was clear to me that Canadians are in the midst of a real renaissance of engagement. I've seen it in the extraordinary generosity and ingenuity with which people have raised funds for the Foundation. They're organizing garage sales, concerts, cycling trips, and bake sales. They're making bequests, donating air miles, and giving a day's pay. The outpouring has been overwhelming. More than $15 million in our first 3.5 years.
It's a pleasure to be here today in such a august company. I'm sorry, I'm going to have my back to some of you. We do want your questions more than mine. I get to ask questions for a living, so I'm not at all offended to step aside for you, especially you students. So as we go, please pass them up, and I will get to them. And I'd like to start by thanking both of you for being here. And asking the question, I mean, you raised it in the video, Stephen. It's about engagement. The Grandmothers event was partly about engaging grandmothers here. This is corporate engagement. So let's go back. Some people haven't even been aware of Beyond Miles, so it's a good opportunity to spread the word. How did it happen? Whose idea was it?
Well, I think in many companies, these things happen somewhat by osmosis. We felt we wanted to make a difference. Most corporations in this country donate money in form of checks or activities to charities. We felt we wanted to try and do a little bit more and try and actually make things happen as opposed to just contribute dollars. And it seemed to us, obviously we have a currency that is highly valuable. It can fly people pretty much anywhere in the world. Canada makes an extraordinary contribution globally to international development relative to the scale of the country. Obviously we could do more, but we felt we wanted to take organizations that were active in Canada and help them get the people around the world to where it mattered. And so Beyond Miles was put together over quite a long period. My team who did it are here in the audience today. And that was the basis of it, was to take Canadian skills, both somewhat within the country but mostly overseas, to help people get off the ground, and both literally from a flying point of view and metaphorically from assisting where it was necessary.
There are a number of organizations that benefit. Médecins Sans Frontières would be one. There are others. Stephen, when you heard about it, when this germ of an idea appeared, what was your thought about it?
Oh, I think exaltation would be the modest word to use. It was for us such an extraordinary opportunity to exchange not just grandmothers, although that was a particular fulcrum, but to move people back and forth from the continent, to allow us to take some Canadians who were doing evaluation and monitoring and assessing and keeping track of projects, to move them around the continent, and to get people from the continent to Canada, to get some Canadians into other parts of Canada. It just is it's a tremendously valuable program, because if one accumulates enough miles, it allows for significant freedom of movement. We had to genuflect before Aeroplan. We got down.
Did the genuflecting actually.
We got down on our hands and knees and said, "Will you make us super elite so we could have some particular entree points?" And they said, God bless them, yes. And it made it pretty well possible for us to do most things. And Aeroplan is part of the Star Alliance,
That's
I
right.
guess. So another thing happened which was tremendously helpful to the foundation, and I think to all of the groups who are involved. The South African Airways, along with Lufthansa United, were part of that. And when a major carrier in Africa joined the Aeroplan network, then it meant that we had even more access than we'd had before. And that was a true benefit which they have now opened the doors to.
Let's get a sense of the scale and what it's meant. So from your point of view...
Well, we started out with our partners, CIBC and American Express, by seeding this for the 7 groups with 12 million miles, and that was in May of this year. And since then, we've had more than 17 million miles donated by members. And you in the room today, Stephen's got one of the cards, so I'm going to thrust it as well. You can donate miles, and people have found that this isn't miles that would otherwise go to loss. This is people, what we've seen is people contributing a small portion of their outstanding balance, one or even several times, towards the charities of their choice. So it's been 150% more response from our members than we as a company put in ourselves, and we would hope that it would continue that way.
And if I may just add a footnote, while it is, of course, of enormous benefit to the Stephen Lewis Foundation, I want to make the important point that Every single one of these organizations is absolutely first-rate in the work they do. Have no qualms whatsoever that when you're contributing miles to any one of those who are listed, you're making a very real contribution to the work they do. It's truly significant.
Yeah, and can I just add, Veterinarians Without Borders, I think probably wouldn't have existed without Beyond Miles. When some people at their annual veterinary convention for the Canadian vets heard about this, they put their thinking caps on and, from what I understand, actually created Vets Without Borders to take animal husbandry skills around the world. And in many of these communities, the ability to keep your animals healthy and properly fed and watered is fundamental to the survival of the community. So that's what I said at the beginning of wanting to actually help create something rather than just write a check.
All right, there's the pitch. It's not something the Canadian Club does often, but you do all have cards and also information about the Stephen Lewis Foundation for that matter. If you are inclined, feel free. In terms of the role of the corporation in helping, and it's something, Stephen, you've spent a lot of time, obviously, thinking about. Rupert, it's a difficult line to walk when you're a public company because you're talking about value that belongs, some would say, to your shareholders. How do you justify it internally to be a giver on a corporate level?
Well, I think it depends which end of the spectrum you're either at the Friedman end of the spectrum of profit at all costs, essentially, or Keynes right at the other end.
I'm not at the Friedman.
No, nor are we. And I think the reason that I regard it as totally on side to do what we're doing are really two. The first is to do with our members. If you engage your members in a program like Aeroplan, and I assume that most people in the room are members, if it is the members donating their currency essentially in conjunction with us, then this is good for the profitability of the business because it engages the members further. We're about a brand, we're about aspirations, we're about good experiences, and donating to charity, particularly in a focused way like this, in our view, is. So I think if you engage the people who generate the profit for the shareholders in the way that we have, I think you're entirely on side. The hidden part of it is the employee side. For us, it is a hugely competitive market in Canada to hire good people, particularly in businesses where you're trying to create a new business as opposed to run an existing business, and that's what we've done with Aeroplan. If you have factors like this, if you had features of the employment experience that include these sort of charitable activities, it makes a big difference as an employer. And you can look at any survey about what makes a company good to work for, and these sort of things are high up on the list. 2 of our employees have been to Ghana helping out with Engineers Without Borders on projects there. And that sort of thing defines you as an employer, and that is good for the shareholder as well.
Stephen, we know that more and more corporations understand why giving locally makes business sense. There's a kind of a goodwill associated with it. This target of 1% of corporate profit seems elusive. Getting corporations on this side of the world to think about Africa is
very difficult.
How do you do it?
I think by raising the issues time and time again and making them come to life as vividly as possible. And there is an increasing corporate groundswell around the world of concern. As yet, the big multinational corporations, whether in Canada or abroad, have been reluctant to make financial contributions to some of these struggles. For instance, corporations have not given to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. The only people who have tended to do that are the Gates Foundation types, but not the corporate world. And that's where Bono came in and created the RED campaign, so that by having additional product lines, it would create an incentive from which profits could then go to the Global Fund. The multinational corporations seem to need additional incentives over and above the simple prescript of corporate social responsibility. But I just feel, and the more I move around the country, the more I'm persuaded of it, that as people understand the issues, whether it's Afghanistan, Darfur, or AIDS, or neglected diseases, which is something that James Orbinski and Médecins Sans Frontières and others have talked about, they warm to it. They can be engaged in it. And I'm not depressed about it, not yet anyway. One keeps hammering away.
And the message that you would send, Rupert, to other corporations is what? Because you have a commodity that is easy so to speak. I don't make light of your contribution, but it's a transferable commodity. It's not cash that people can point to.
It is indeed, but almost every corporation has either products or services which can be used, and they don't necessarily have to be used in far-flung places. They can be used right here in Canada. I mean, Air Canada's Kids Horizon is a good example. They fly people around between hospitals in the country, their communities and hospitals. So whatever business you're in, something about what you do can be used to support this kind of activity, and it just requires careful thought to work out what that is and to publicize it so that people get the leverage.
I add as a footnote that the services, which, for example, Aeroplan provides, just this last week we had a group of grandmothers from South Africa travel to Swaziland, courtesy of this program, to do a training seminar with the Swazi grandmothers on local activism and working with people living with AIDS. It was amazing. We couldn't have done it without the plan. But having said that, may I utter one heretical note? The services and goods are wonderful, but don't be deterred from cash contributions. I have learned over the years that those are also useful.
We should note that on a list that includes the Dalai Lama and Gates, you're probably not as good as the one and not as rich as the other. So
I think that's fair.
you need the money.
Close to Gates, but not yet.
Fair enough. We'll take some questions from the room. This one is for Rupert. It's a question that many of us want to know when we give to a charity, and that is to make sure that the funds we're giving get to the needy, rather than flying around employees of foundations. How did the two of you make sure that that happens?
Well, that was part of the reason we selected the charities we support very carefully. Each of them has a strong reputation for probity, integrity, careful use of funds, and that's really, it's the filter on the way in. We don't expect, or nor would we do, sort of post-audit of where the miles had been used. We would trust the integrity of these institutions to use them appropriately. And frankly, flying somebody around in the country to get a big event like what Stephen and the Stephen Lewis Foundation did for the AIDS Day is, in my view, a very good use of those miles, because it makes something happen that raises national, international awareness of the issue. So I think you filter on the way in, and then you let the organizations do what they wish.
Where do you think that kind of concern should fall? Is that a relevant concern? Do we need to worry about the overhead of a charity, or should we just think past that to the greater good?
We're always worried about the overhead of charities. Just look at what's happened around the Toronto Star expose of the MAD campaign, valid or otherwise. Obviously, people are concerned about administrative costs.
Yeah.
I think, again, it's difficult because I don't want to be selective. There are so many excellent non-governmental organizations that are not on this list. But these are first-rate outfits that one can be confident spend the minimum on administrative costs and scrupulously monitor the use of the miles. I mean, the plan is incredibly valuable to us, and no one would dare abuse it. It would be their life at stake.
We have a couple of questions for you, Stephen, and I want to ask one that I think many people are still quite concerned about, and that is, you talked about this in your book, conditions attached to loans. This goes back many years with the IMF and the World Bank. Are there ways to work around those kinds of things?
Well, it's very difficult for the African governments to work around them because even to this day, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund impose macroeconomic structures on countries within which they must function, and they're not allowed to function outside. It's absolutely fascinating that at the Singapore meetings a few weeks ago of the international financial institutions, the United Kingdom government, for the first time in anyone's recollection, froze a £50 million grant to the World Bank because they were so offended by the World Bank conditionality that was being imposed on recipient countries. And they said, in effect, until you alter the nature of your conditionality, we're not going to free the money. And the government of Norway forgave the debts of 5 different countries because they said they were odious debts. They said that they, the Norwegian government, had been complicit in the debt because they had given it to dictators knowing that it would be the people of the country who paid the price and the dictators who had the free ride. So there is developing in the industrial world a sensitivity to the way in which Africa has been abused by international financial institutions. The best way around it, whether one is dealing with Zimbabwe, where you've got a political regime that's impossible, or whether one is dealing with an international financial institution with irregular and unwarranted demands, the best way to get around it is to go right to the grassroots, is to go to the excellent NGOs on the ground and the indigenous local NGOs.
This is a question for Rupert. How can I redeem my Aeroplan miles to get a first-class ticket to LA?
I think Amanda has suddenly lost her ability to read, but we'll see.
No, it's a good question, actually. We won't take those kinds of questions.
Our new program, Classic Plus Flight Rewards.
It's true. Every seat on the plane, I see the ads. In terms of organizations that want to join the program, are you limiting it, or will you continue to open it?
It's only been running for around 8 months. There's a volume versus value here. We wanted to make really sure that each organization that we supported got enough miles to be able to do something tangible and material, to be able to rely on that flow of miles for their travel needs for a number of years. So we'll be keeping it at the 7 for the time being. We will have a look at expanding it. But we also have another charitable program where if you have a community charity, you can set up a limited account, and for a period of a month you can get all your friends and family and relatives and business associates to donate into that charity. And those monies have been, or those miles have been used for all sorts of things. You know, kids' hockey scholarships, for flying people who need emergency treatment from one province to another. So we do have a community-based program, but beyond miles at the moment, we'd like to run it for at least a year, see how it works, and make sure each of the organizations in it is getting what they need out of it before we think about expanding it.
It's important to note, I mean, Aeroplan's solving an accounting problem for itself in a way by forcing people to use their miles in a certain amount of time. Mm-hmm. It's a tedious accounting problem, but there it is.
Yeah.
But you're also giving up real money. I mean,
absolutely.
Miles that expire unused have a value to you.
They do, and you know, but to me, is that a significant number of dollars? It is. Is it worthwhile given what it achieves for the members and for our employees in the community? I think that it's a small price to pay. Now, if it suddenly became half of all the miles we issued ended up in Stephen's pocket for the Stephen Lewis Foundation, I mean, that would be a high-class problem. It hasn't got to that point yet, and I suspect that I suspect that the two will remain in equilibrium. And as far as we're concerned, you know, we knew going in that would be the case. It's well within the bounds of what we think is appropriate for us as a company to bear, and it seems to be working pretty well.
May I say that several of the organizations have received, when did we begin? In March?
In May.
May that actually came in. Several of the organizations have received between 4 and 5 million miles out of the generosity of people turning their miles in, and most have received over 1 million miles. So it's been a very excellent program in freeing miles for movement around the world.
This is a question that's slightly off topic, but not for you, I'm afraid, and that is from Miriam Strauss. Despite the remarkable work and efforts of Mr. Lewis and others, the situation in Darfur remains appalling and unacceptable. What miracle would it take to turn it around?
It would take a miracle on the part of the NATO countries, probably, to decide to go in and force a resolution, which would mean to dismantle the Janjaweed militias who are engaged in such constant brutality and sexual violence and raping in indiscriminate ways, the like of which there is no other analogy on this planet. We can't really do it through the United Nations because we know that one of the permanent members, probably China, would veto a Security Council resolution given that they have oil interests in Sudan and are close to the Sudanese government. It's rather like the Balkans, I'm afraid, where the Western countries have to decide that they're going to support the Africa Union troops in significant numbers with significant logistical and military support and go in themselves. This would not be a difficult situation to resolve. I hope everybody understands that. It would not be easy, but you could, I think, take on the Sudanese government and its troops in a way which would relatively quickly impose some kind of settling situation on Darfur. But it's just, I don't know what's gone wrong with the world. I don't know what's gone mad with the world, but we've had it for 3 years. We describe it as a genocide. I noticed that Kofi Annan, as he leaves the United Nations, is begging the world to do something about Darfur. All of the organizations that are involved in the Stop Darfur campaign deserve to be supported. But unless the West decides to do something and do it seriously, it will not change. And when the Africa Union troops leave within the next 6 months, it will be a slaughter of the innocents, the like of which the world has rarely seen.
I'll take both your thoughts on this, and you're soon to be a diplomat no longer, so speak freely.
I shall try.
He sometimes does.
I know it's hard for you. Why does the West ignore Africa?
That's a very, very difficult question because if one looks at Rwanda and one looks at Darfur and one looks at AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, diseases, poverty, environment, I tend to agree with Romeo Dallaire that there is an unacknowledged subterranean racism at work in a lot of the absence of response. There's also a tendency just to discard Africa as no longer of geopolitical value in the world, or to engage in the vile slander that Africa is too corrupt to support. But the truth of the matter is that there's just some inexplicable resistance somewhere to the continent and a willingness to find millions of lives expendable. I mean, absolutely beyond me that we now have antiretroviral treatment at prices which countries can bear if the Western world meets its commitments, and we still don't guarantee sustainable resources, and we still don't get the kind of technical assistance except in individual places to overcome the pandemic. I mean, you have Doctors Without Borders, magnificent outfit. You have Partners in Health, you have Dignitas, you have a number of models which are working in conjunction with governments. There's no neocolonialism about it. They work with the government and within the government dimensions. And the governments have tremendous determination within Africa, but we cannot get the Western world to engage fully. And I will admit to you, I don't understand it. I cannot put an easy identity on it. It's so much paralysis, inertia, indifference, passivity. It's unbelievable. And these G8 countries, they meet in Gleneagles in July of 2005, and they make these commitments solemn and earnest and public, and the commitments are falling apart now, and everybody sees it. Trade, debt, aid, they're all falling apart. And we know it, and no one seems to give a tinker's damn in the political leadership of the G8.
And I think all I would add from a very minor key to that is there is not much economic incentive as well. And sadly, many of the political moves that we see around the world are fundamentally underpinned by economic interests. And in sub-Saharan Africa, other than in South Africa in the mining countries, there is very little economic interest. So whether you're a free market enterprise fellow or not, if the money isn't following, then often governments are not willing to make the effort, and that's a tragedy.
There is oil in Nigeria, and oil in Angola, and minerals in the Congo, and diamonds in Sierra Leone. I mean, there's enough rapacious activity to take everything out of the continent.
But not put it back in.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Well, Rupert, this is a fairly pointed question. Are Canadian corporations doing enough?
I would have to say no. You look at some other benchmarks, and Canadian corporations do not do as much or do things as often as their peers in some of the other G8 countries. Nonetheless, I think Canadian charities domestically are extremely well supported. I think Canada's corporate focus tends to be domestic. I think what we'd like to see is more focus outside of the country and taking Canadian skills, knowledge, or essentially just straight dollars, as Stephen said earlier, into some of these places where the problems are of a magnitude that you can't even imagine living comfortably in Canada.
We talked about that at lunch, tax disincentives for Canadian-based foundations to apply money abroad, and it's things like that. I see Don Johnson here. There may be a new project for you, Don. There may be changes like that in Canada that would change many organizations, I imagine. Should we focus more on those, or is that too detailed, too small a matter when there are these great urgent issues?
I think It would be wonderful if the tax laws in Canada allowed for greater advocacy on the part of nonprofits and on the part of foundations. It's odd that it's easier to set up in the United States as a nonprofit and have complete freedom of advocacy. The only inhibition is that you can spend no more than $200,000 a year to lobby members of Congress. Why one would want to spend that much money to lobby members is beyond me. But you can certainly do advocacy unrestricted. In Canada, the restrictions are tough. You would jeopardize your tax status if you overdid it. But that's a particular channel that has to be pursued with and through Don Johnson, since he has volunteered to take the lead on this.
Thank you, Don.
I've had such a good track record as well.
I have interviewed Stephen over the course of time, and this next question reminds me of something that I often think. It comes from Archbishop Romero, Catholic secondary school students, wondering what things or people or faith or something else that gives you the courage to keep pushing people to act when so much of the world sat and still seems to sit. Where does your optimism come from?
Oh, my optimism comes quite simply because there's no point in futility. I mean, you feel, all of us in this room who have visited Africa from time to time and dealt with these issues feel moments of despair. It's impossible not to feel otherwise. You see so much carnage around you. But you also see resilience and heroism and sophistication and intelligence and generosity of spirit, particularly at the grassroots. And you know that that's ultimately what will prevail on the continent. And you don't want to lapse into futility because it makes no sense. So you continue fighting. You're sustained by the strength of the continent. I hesitate to say this in such august company, and you must not penalize the foundation when I say it. But I'm a democratic socialist, and I am driven by the strength of political conviction. I have a kind of Weltanschauung, a view that the struggle for social justice and equality is the reason why people are on this planet, and there's nothing that violates social justice more frontally than what the AIDS pandemic is doing to the world. So for me, I must admit it is a matter of political philosophy, primarily, rather than spiritual impulse or other sources.
I may lapse into my reporter mode here for a moment, but that leads me to wonder, and many may be wondering the same thing, what's next for Stephen Lewis at the end of this year?
Anonymity.
Yes, I can see that happening for you.
Optimistic anonymity.
Simple, unbridled obscurity. I can't wait. Thanks to Aeroplan. Talk about being in debt. My family and I are going on vacation on Saturday for a couple of weeks, and we'll think about. I want to continue to try to do with close colleagues who've been so strong in their allies, to continue to do the advocacy internationally and to find an alternative auspices within which to do that after I leave at the end of December. And I'm hoping that will be possible. And I particularly want to try to do some advocacy in support of the surprising and unexpected recommendation to the United Nations that they form, for the first time ever, an international independent agency for women with significant clout, resources, and strength at country level. Because if we had such an organization, and the United Nations has been abysmally bad on women's issues and women's rights in the last 60 years, if we had that organization in place, we might be able to do something about the devastation that's being caused to women around the planet. And I'd like to be involved in that struggle. I feel very buoyant somehow about the future. I refuse to believe I'm as old as Toronto Life says I am.
And Rupert, in terms of the message that you would give, this is a business crowd. There may be some who can take it home with them.
Well, I think if people can follow by Stephen's example, let alone Aeroplans, then I clearly think we'll make a difference. And I truly hope that he doesn't pass into optimistic obscurity, but exactly the opposite. And if you think of Canadians who've made an impact on the world stage, Stephen is very, very close to the top of the list. And we can...
I do. And that role is likely to continue, I imagine. How do you engage the Canadian government? What's your relationship with the Canadian government? And I guess we speak particularly of this Harper government.
Well, it's not intimate. I'm sorry, everyone. This is actually my last quasi-formal appearance before the end of the year in this role, and I'm a little punchy, and I want you to forgive me.
Strong water here.
I was interested in the fact that on World AIDS Day, the government did announce a total of $120 million for AIDS-related initiatives. There was nothing new in them. They tended to be extensions of what the Paul Martin government had done before. There was no sense of what the future might hold, no sense of particular vision in one direction or another. So it's difficult to say what will happen. The one ominous note, which is really surprising in light of everything, is that if you look carefully at the growth in gross national product and the percentage which is going to foreign aid, to official development assistance, we may become the only member of the G8 where the percentage ratio actually declines as of 2008. The British said they will reach the elusive target of 0.7% by 2013. The French say by 2012. The Germans and Italians say by 2015. Canada has endorsed the 0.7. We were the architect of the 0.7. We've never set up a timetable, and it would appear that we may begin to backslide from where we are now, which is around 0.3, come 2008. That's almost beyond belief, because no one, not even the United States and Japan, who never endorsed the target, are reducing the percentage amount. That's just nuts. So I hope the government... Well, we may have a change in government by then. One never knows. There are some Philistines in the crowd.
On that slightly political note, we will end here. I think Irene David is going to come and give the official thank you. But on behalf of certainly me personally and the Canadian Club, it's a thrill to have you both here to tell us more about this. And I guess one last pitch: use those cards.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.